Welcome back to the Groundless Ground podcast, the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. You can subscribe to, download, and review the Groundless Ground on iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn, and of course, find out more at groundlessground.com. I'm ready to go. How about you? Best wishes to all for a joyful holiday season, and may the new year bring peace, health, and awakening to all beings everywhere. This final episode in Season 1 of the Groundless Ground podcast features 2 consecutive Dharma talks I recently gave at Marin Sangha on the 5 aggregates. In the Pali Suttas, the Buddha often identified the 5 aggregates as the main agent of mental and emotional suffering. The first talk deconstructs the illusory heap nature of the 5 aggregates and explicates their pivotal role in both creating and liberating the human mind-body complex from suffering. I apologize in advance for the poor recording quality of this first talk. I did my best to make it as listenable as possible. You can skip ahead to 27 minutes where the second talk begins, although there's foundational information about the 5 aggregates included in the first talk. The second talk takes a deep dive into vastness by investigating the relationship of the 5 aggregates to Theravāda teachings on what the Buddha called deathless or deathlessness, and then tracks that term's evolution through the Mahāyāna and Vajrayana teachings on emptiness and buddhanature.
The 5 aggregates are the main categories early Buddhism used to analyze all human experience, internal, external, all phenomena can be characterized by these 5 aggregates. I know probably all of you know about the 5 aggregates. I thought I would quickly go through them. First is form or rupa, and form covers any physical component of perception. So in the suttas, they like to say any physical component of experience, but of course we're more sophisticated, so we know that experience, frankly, is a matter of perception. Anything that shows up with some kind of form is the first aggregate. The second aggregate is the feeling tone of experience, or Vedana. In neuroscience language, that would be the affective tone of any experience. In Buddhist psychology, we say that Vedana shows up in 3 main categories: pleasant, unpleasant, and altogether neutral. Which, by the way, neutral can be a great relief for people. If they're normally caught in pleasant or unpleasant, neutral is like this whole huge awakening for people. I'm going to talk quite a bit about Vedana as we go forward. The third one is perception itself. Now, first-person research, which is basically what the Buddha and all the Buddhist teachers did and all the Buddhist practitioners do, it means you use your own attention to investigate phenomena, either external or internal. That's first-person research. Actually, the Buddhists did a really good job of determining the way cognition works. Perception is basically 2 different things. And this is in terms of the aggregates. Okay, so with the 12 links of dependent origination, they actually break this out a little bit more. But here in the 5 aggregates, perception covers cognition itself, percepts coming in and then being perceived with any one of the 5 senses. And then it also includes the way we identify things, so the way we categorize them after they're perceived. And we do a very good job of that. We're pattern recognition animals, as I've said here many times. So we love to categorize things, put them in their little boxes. Basically, perception, this third aggregate, is how we identify things for their distinctive marks and features so we can figure out what they are. Very useful. The fourth of the 5 aggregates is called volitional formations. Of course, this is the one that trips everybody up. You could just boil this one down to, it's a term for the multifarious mental factors we use in order to make choices and set intention. There's some aspect of free will here, even though neuroscience will tell us there's no such thing as free will. It's okay. There's some feeling of having free will, being able to determine, to make a choice, and also to intend. That's the sense of volition. Now, Buddhism and all the schools of Buddhism will tell you that this is always influenced by karmic habit, underlying unconscious motivations and habits that we have in the psyche, in the body, that drive us. And they drive us at such a deep level of awareness, at such a deep level of the psyche we're generally not even aware of. Often volitional formations, it's thankfully the one thing that you can really tell your practice is going well, because you're doing less of the mindless sort of being followed around, led around by habits, and more being in active choice making and intention setting and intention enacting. The fifth of the 5 aggregates is consciousness itself. There are many kinds of consciousnesses in Buddhism, depending on what school. But in the way the Buddha taught it, consciousness covers cognition arisen through any of the 6 sense faculties. And these 6 sense faculties are ears, eyes, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And that pretty much covers it. You really can't have any kind of experience, can't have any perception through any other way than these 6 sense faculties. Now, the 5 aggregates themselves, according to the early Buddhist teachings, are the main referent for suffering in the First Noble Truth. So when the Buddha says unsatisfactoriness, he is pointing directly at the 5 aggregates. It's really not the 5 aggregates themselves that are the problem. Try to imagine your existence without the 5 aggregates. It's the clinging to the 5 aggregates that must be removed to attain liberation from suffering. Since we are interested in the application of Dharma in daily life, I think it behooves us to admit that every one of these aggregates is a necessary component of human life, human activity, and human intelligence. We really can't function without the 5 aggregates. And yet, the Buddha consistently targeted these 5 aggregates as the main cause of human suffering. So how can this be?
He always said the 5 aggregates subject to clinging.
Exactly. So now you might be asking, well, of course I'm going to cling to them. I need them to function. So again, we're back at how can this be? Really, the secret is mostly the Buddha's instructions for awakening rests on cutting through the illusory heap nature of the 5 aggregates. So what does that mean? HEAP. All the aggregates together. It's what they do when they all get together that we cling to. It's not the individual aggregates. It's what happens when they all get together. Because together, the 5 aggregates give the appearance of object solidity where there is none. And they give the appearance of self-separateness where there is none. And they also give the appearance of phenomenal permanence where there is none. It's all a beautiful illusion designed to help every single one of us feel secure and safe, able to know what will come. And frankly, none of that is true either. Got this phenomenal virtual reality machine spinning a heap of lies about our existence. In fact, what the Buddha is saying is that clear insight into the impermanent, interdependently arising nature of the 5 aggregates is the wisdom that dissolves clinging to the illusory nature of the 5 aggregates. So in fact, awakening is like radical deconstruction. Continually tearing apart this together heap that looks like something when it's all together, but isn't that at all. So you have to deconstruct. You have to really look deeply, which is what the Buddha was always saying. Now, according to the suttas, there are 2 principal modes in which clinging to the 5 aggregates occurs: appropriation and identification. And these 2 habits of reification exist in parallel process, which means you can't have one without the other. There is no appropriation without identification. Appropriation and identification are at play every time we find ourselves caught in the identity view that phenomena are me and mine, or not me, not mine. In fact, a good catch-all term for the heap nature of the aggregates, that togetherness, could be selfing. I think that's a really good term that everybody has some sense of. And I like the ing part of it, because nothing's static. So it's just this continual process of appropriating meaning, appropriating solidity, appropriating thingness, appropriating selfness to experience and phenomena that basically don't have any of that. And identification is when we appropriate something to something and then we categorize it. Then we solidify it with a name. We're always naming things to give them form beyond the form they actually have. I couldn't give this talk anywhere but here. Early Buddhism taught that full understanding of the sense bases and developing dispassion toward their perceptual objects is key to liberation from self-delusion. But the suttas actually also point out a difference between the aggregates and the six sense bases. Now that's really interesting. So the suttas basically are saying the aggregates, which are what arises in the sense bases, are not the same thing as the six sense bases. And yet, while both of these are sources of self-clinging, this is how we get this information about a solid separate self, after all. It's what convinces us that there's things outside, there's a self inside. The six sense bases basically do that. That's how they perceive, right? And the five aggregates, the way that we perceive and we act with all of this, even solidifies it further. So while both are sources of self-clinging, the aggregates influence views about the self, whereas the six sense bases give rise to feelings of attraction and aversion. The aggregates, in their heap nature, when they get all together, what they tell us is not true. But if you deconstruct them, pretty much you can tell who you are. You're just this continual stream of phenomena coming and going, and that's actually true. The aggregates in and of themselves are not false. This is when they get together. It's like a band of thieves. At this point, you might say to me, well, if the six sense bases give rise to feelings of attraction and aversion, isn't that just Vedana? Here we are back at the feeling tone of experience. So what is the difference? I feel like a philosopher tonight. This is the way my philosopher friends give their lectures. They just ask all these questions and then proceed to try to answer them. I'm not sure they do. I'm not sure I am. Vedana refers to the fact that when humans perceive objects, they do not process that information the way, for instance, a computer does. The human body, which, by the way, all those six sense bases are in the human body. So the human body perceives and almost immediately categorizes the information it perceives by emitting a concurrent feeling tone about the information it's just received. Craving and aversion are the reactive habit responses which follow the feeling tone associated with an object. This is interesting because now see, even Vedana is not the culprit, right? All experience has a feeling tone. That's just part of our evolutionary makeup. Craving and aversion are the reactive responses that we have when we're unaware of the feeling tone. Again, this is radical deconstruction that I'm proposing to you tonight. It's almost as though the key to awakening is being able to slow things down enough in your perception that you can actually be right there at the source of the percept. You're shaking your head no. Why not?
It just doesn't happen that way for me.
It doesn't happen that way for me either. That doesn't mean it can't happen. I am not a Buddha. I have a sneaking suspicion that is what I would be doing. Radical deconstruction would just be my, bottom line. That would just be my way. It would be natural. I wouldn't even have to think about it. It would just be happening. Often, this reactive approach and avoidance habit leads to unskillful thoughts, words, and actions. This is why recognizing and lessening reactive craving and aversion are so fundamental to liberating mental suffering. I really think that's why it's the second noble truth. The second noble truth is not get rid of Vedana. It's not get rid of perception. It's attend to the reactivity that is arising prior to your capacity to actually recognize. We all know that as human beings, when our perception and recognition kicks in along the train, something's coming in, I have a feeling tone, now I'm reacting to it, now I'm saying something, now I'm doing something. You know, you could wake up anywhere along that timeline, sooner, later, never, right? Much later, way, like 2 days later, oh my gosh, what have I done? This is part of humanness, and that's why it's the second noble truth. I am proposing now to myself, any one of you who wish to come on my bandwagon, and I did not do this in my textbook because I did not actually have this realization about the 5 aggregates until 2 days ago when I sat down to write this Dharma talk. And I, as usual, went into the suttas. I was interested in the 5 aggregates and I had all this information. And then I go to the suttas and I start reading. And suddenly I began to realize it's the heap nature of the 5 aggregates. It's not the 5 aggregates themselves that creates the unsatisfactoriness. Am I wrong, Bill? Is this the way the 5 aggregates are taught usually? Have I just been asleep and not realizing it? What I'm saying is, have you ever heard a Dharma teacher tell you it's the heap nature and not the aggregates?
No.
Me either. So maybe I'm wrong. But it sounds right. I don't know. I think you'll have to decide for yourself. See, this is when Dharma teachers hide behind the Buddha. And what the Buddha said. He said, don't believe me, check it out for yourself. Vedana probably still occurs in an awakened mind due to our animal physical bodily responses. You know, we live in a body. But blindly acting from such base instinct would probably be intercepted and averted from within. And the unawakened mind can do the same with the intentional application of awareness and vigilant mindfulness. Hence, all the practices we've ever been given. Recognize, be aware, and then mindfully attend. Stay with experience so that your skillfulness can actually bear fruit. Let's just quickly work an example, just because I think I need to prove that it's actually true. I want you to think of a recent experience you had where you appropriated something to someone and you identified them as something and it turned out not to be right.
I had this happen during this meditation. I was miserable. What I need to do is ask Lisa how to get rid of muscle spasms.
Okay.
Then I see the clinging to the unpleasantness. And what is interesting about the clinging to the unpleasantness is that it is the heap nature. You don't just cling to the simple unpleasant. You cling to the muscle spasm. And then when I got into that clinging, it was difficult. Suddenly I realized, wow, I'm not having muscle spasms anymore. Wow.
Okay, did you all understand? It sounds like magic, doesn't it? I think it still would have felt magical even if the spasms had continued.
I think they would have gone in and out.
Okay, notice they're not a total solid block. This is a perfect example of the way we perceive permanence. Realize that what we're discussing right now is mundane and so powerful. This is profundity of mundanity. The beautiful example of that. Sometimes in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, they have a phrase for what happened to you. It's called turning the jewel of the mind. Your mind was fixated and coalesced around a specific way of processing experience. And then, due to your wisdom, and the wisdom piece here was when Barbara asked, what is the nature of my suffering? And you pegged it clinging. I am clinging to some notion. I am appropriating something to this body and identifying it as something. That's the appropriation and identification nature of the way the 5 aggregates get heaped together. I'm appropriating it as horrible.
There's something wrong with it.
Oh, absolutely. That's the view piece. Not only is the body sensation horrible and consistent, it's also me. This is all I am. Horrible, consistent, unpleasant experience. That's all I am. And you cut right through that beautifully. Thank you. That was the most wonderful example. Not cling to that, but you should definitely remember that.
Thank you. Don't worry, I won't.
There's a difference between remembering and clinging. Clinging is I have to have that exact experience again. Again, this is the appropriation and identification nature. I am appropriating that I can never have relief, and I am identifying it as the only way I can get free. Remember the experience so you can liberate yourself again. But know that the next time it will happen, it'll be similar but not the same. The suttas often mention 20 types of identity view obtained by considering self in any one of the following 4 relationships to the 5 aggregates. Remember what I said earlier. The 5 aggregates are different from the 6 sense bases because they give rise to identity views. Remember the heap nature. Okay, this is actually the recipe to know whether or not you're being hoodwinked. If you think that the self is identical with the 5 aggregates, that's the first way. The second way is if you think there's any aspect of you that actually possesses the 5 aggregates, owns the 5 aggregates. The third one is if you think there's any part of you is contained in the 5 aggregates. And the fourth is that you are actually within the 5 aggregates. You are under the influence of the heap nature of form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. If you actually think this is who you are and what you are, if you think you're identical with it, you think you own those things, you think that you're contained, or that you actually exist within any one of them, you know that you are now suffering from false identity view. And you're lost in selfing. Wise view is when one no longer regards the aggregates as a reified self-entity or regards oneself as a reified self-entity. Reification is a very important term when we get to this point in this discussion because something is being reified as having thingness. Nagarjuna, in his 70 stanzas on emptiness, which is incredible, I highly recommend you get it and you read the 70 stanzas. He was this incredible bridge between the Pali teachings and the Mahāyāna. In one of the stanzas, he says, conception of self is generated through focusing on the person who is merely imputed, and from the preconception which takes improper objects and overestimates them. So prior to focusing on the person who's merely imputed, thinking that person is real, solid, prior to that, the mind takes improper objects and overestimates them. Imputation of an independently existing self refers specifically to the resulting distortions inherent in the beautiful illusion of the heaps, and that the preconceived overestimation of the solidity, permanence, and separateness of objects refers specifically to the way in which sense perceptions become distorted by innate reifying of the self, operating at the deepest levels of the psyche, and giving rise to our shared delusion of subject-object dualism. By seeing these internal and external phenomena arising from causes and conditions, they will eliminate the whole network of wrong views. To know the ultimate unconditioned, you have to be able to perceive it from the point of view of the non-existence of that thing. Not that you're not a person sitting in a chair. You are. You're here. You're hearing me. I'm here. We're all here. This is happening. It's real. What's not real is the inherent thingness. We are inherently, ultimately, phenomena. Even at a basic level of physics, that's really all we are. We're just a bunch of information and inhabiting different atoms and molecules. At this point in the talk, I feel like it's important for me, before I end, to mention mereness. Mirrorness is not talked a lot about in the Theravāda, and it's pointed to a little bit in the Majjhimaka. It's really pointed at in the Dzogchen and Mahamudra teachings. I could explain mirrorness using modern Western philosophy. Philosopher Dan Zahavi argues first-person givenness, thingness, endows the minimal self with an egoic nature. Other Western philosophers of mind disagree. For instance, Wittgenstein bemoaned the global usage of I, particularly in reference to the minimal self's basic here and now experience, which he did not necessarily regard as personal. They're saying there is an existence, but it's not personal. And in some way, I think the Buddha was actually saying this. One of my Tibetan Buddhist teachers, Zomi Rinpoche, refers to the basic subjectivity of what Western philosophy and Western neuroscience calls a minimal self. He calls it mere I, M-E-R-E, and the Tibetan term is tatsam. And this mere I describes a primarily experiential form of consciousness, not unlike that of a pre-verbal child. So the felt sense of mere I has a childlike immediacy of joyful wonder and relaxed openness. How many of your Buddhist teachers who you really, really love have that joyful wonder? Even though this mere I has primordial ignorance, it's not enlightened. Mere I is not awakened. Mere I perceives the reified higher order concepts and biases and therefore discerns the stream of objects with a cognitive spaciousness. In a way, the mereness of you is what you would be experiencing if you were not hoodwinked by the heaps. Body sitting in a chair, listening to the sound, cognizing the words, having thoughts about it all, maybe getting ready to go home, thinking about the things you have to do to get ready for tomorrow. This is your mereness. And all of that can happen without the selfing that causes so much aggravation. What I proposed to do was follow up what Philip did last week, that sort of more mundane wisdom that he talked about. There is a way to step into the vastness through this more mundane kind of deconstruction. And honestly, just as beautifully exemplified tonight, it is possible to cut through and deconstruct any moment. This is how you never not meditate, no matter what you're doing, if you're paying attention to whether or not you're being hoodwinked by the heaps.
This is the follow-up on the empty nature of the aggregates.
Last week, I talked about the 5 aggregates. I know there's a couple of people who were not here last week. According to Buddhist philosophy and the Buddha, the self and all the things we perceive are made up of 5 aggregates. The 5 are form, anything that has form. But we agreed, because of neuroscience, we know thoughts actually have form too. Even mental phenomena come under form. And then sensation, Vedana, the feeling tone of experience. Everything comes in 3 feeling tones. And I actually had a request tonight to say some things about neutral, so I will quickly do that. When the body and the 5 senses perceive experience, usually there's an automatic feeling tone that goes along with experience. Pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral are the 3 main categories. And then there's perception, and in Buddhist philosophy, perception is pretty much all of our cognition, anything that we cognize, as well as what's called sana, so all the ways in which we categorize and name things and figure out what they are. All that processing falls under perception. And then there's volitional formations. Basically, the volitional formations are the ways in which we're either acting habitually and we don't know it. That's sort of just these underlying habits that we have. Or the ways in which we choose to act. That's the volitional aspect. And then the last thing is consciousness, which, as I said last week, is a mixed bag. There's so many forms of consciousness in Buddhism. The big insight from last week was that these 5 qualities, on their own, we need them. We can't exist without them, except when they get together, they become this other thing, this huge delusion, permanence, and a solid, real self in a solid, real world. In fact, when they come together, they cause us to cling. to the reality of things in a way in which things are not actually real. So obviously, I'm here, you're here, we're real. But there's a quality of separateness and permanence that when the aggregates get together, we get, as I said last week, hoodwinked by the heaps. Sanskrit or Pali, the word for aggregate is translated as heap. I have a phenomenal example of neutral, actually, that happened with one of my patients this week. Normally, the people I work with don't experience very much neutral. They're usually extreme in their reactivity, one way or the other. They're either very hyper-aroused or they're very collapsed and hypo-aroused. I have this one person I've been working with who came to me with ostensibly an anxiety disorder, but in fact what he had was a thought disorder. So what would happen is he would have something occur, and then it would immediately lead him to go down what he called the garden path of predicting some intense catastrophe that would occur. And it didn't even have to be something that happened to him. It could be anything. And his mind would just be, as he said, off to the races. We worked on that for quite some time, and one of the things that I ended up teaching him was concentration meditation practice, the way in which your mind gets really collected. And somehow he really took to the practice. And so for the last 8 months or so, he really has been practicing diligently every single day. And every once in a while he would come in and tell me about a first jhana experience. Now, of course, I'm not using any of these terms with him. I've never said any of this, but he has serious, one-pointed, collected mind. He'll even go into some of the other ones spontaneously, where he has no body, this or that. And it's always such a joy for him because it's such a relief. His mind is no longer plaguing him when he has these experiences. And as you all know, I'm very big on telling him not to cling to these experiences because all the other meditation experiences are equally fine. Along with all this, he also, for a number of years, has been dealing with prostate numbers and not wanting to do anything about it. And he's a very intelligent person and does a lot of research. And so for the last 6 months, he's sort of been on this journey with his varying different kinds of prostate numbers that would tell him he might have to do something. He came in this week and he looked at me and he said, well, so I got my numbers, first time I've had them in 3 months, and they were very low. And he showed me the email from his urologist, and the email said, based on this, probably not going to have to do anything about it for 10 years. And he looked at me and he said, I figured I would be jumping off the walls. I would be so excited. He said, but actually, when I got the news, I felt he used the word equal. He said, I thought this was very unusual. Normally, I would be so excited. I don't really have to think about this for the next 10 years. He said, but somehow it just seemed like everything else. I said, what do you mean? He said, it comes and goes. And I thought to myself, wow, that's the Dharma. That's truly the Dharma. And I thought, and this is neutral. Neutral does not mean I'm not happy that my numbers are amazing and I probably won't have to do anything about this for 10 years. Neutral means I recognize this, as all things, will come and go. And there's nothing here for me to cling to. So I was going to tell this story anyway tonight because I thought you would all enjoy it after our talk last week. So how does that inform your question about neutral?
I don't really feel like I ever experienced neutral. Anything that's not unpleasant is pleasant to me.
So when we say pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, you have to hear it this way. Craving, aversion, and equanimity.
I think I crave to the absence of the aversion.
Right. Vedana comes in 3 feeling tones. Experience, we're either drawn to it, we are averse to it, or it's just experience. Equanimity, craving, and aversion are the states in which we are either going to suffer from or we're going to be liberated in. In Tibetan Buddhism, in the Mahāyāna, instead of saying equanimity, they say equality. That's because for them, there is a recognition of the equalness of all phenomena, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, ambivalent, no matter what it is, it's phenomena. Inherent in equality is wisdom. There is no equality without wisdom. And it's true, Theravāda has this little bit in the Brahmavihara of equanimity, but is very, very strong in the Mahāyāna. And why? Because they don't use craving and aversion so much, they use hope and fear instead. So hope, you go toward, fear, you recoil from. And for them, all experience brings up one of the two, or there's a recognition of impermanence and emptiness. Even though this person I've been working with doesn't really know about emptiness, he experienced the empty nature of the news. It was lovely news, and it was empty of anything to cling to. So beautiful. So the idea that neutral leads to boredom is only if one has restlessness in the mind.
Right.
That is a function of restlessness. One can be very one-pointed and clear with neutrality. When we talk about craving, aversion, and equalness, we're basically saying craving, aversion, second noble truth, third noble truth is there is equalness, there is liberation in equalness, in recognizing the nature of all phenomena as impermanent, as not self. That leads to equanimity or equalness. You know, this is one of those interesting fine points in Buddhism. And I also think it depends what school of Buddhism you happen to be practicing in how this is interpreted, because they emphasize different aspects of emptiness. That's the thing that evolved in Buddhism, was the understanding of and the attentiveness to emptiness. I promised last week that we would step into the realm of vastness. And it might seem odd, but in fact, we can actually step into the realm of vastness through the 5 aggregates. The Buddha is always full of so many surprises. But that's the reason to read the suttas, you know. I'm going to read you a quote. This is something the Buddha said. It's in the Samyutta Nikaya. The 5 aggregates, when developed and cultivated, have the deathless as their ground, the deathless as their destination, the deathless as their final goal. So the Buddha is very directly saying that the 5 aggregates, these things that are supposed to be such an impediment to awakening, in fact, when they are, and he uses the words developed and cultivated. I read this and I thought, it's not possible to actually develop and cultivate the 5 aggregates because we have them. We don't have to develop and cultivate them. So I thought, well, maybe what he meant was we have to develop an understanding of the nature of the 5 aggregates and cultivate the view when they are arising. You can take that as you wish. That's how I read this. So if we develop intimacy with the 5 aggregates, as I said last week, when we deconstruct them, we don't allow them to collect together and hoodwink us, and we recognize the nature of experience as it actually is. We cultivate the capacity to recognize what the Buddha ultimately wanted us to realize, which is the deathless. And he characterizes the deathless as the ground. In fact, that would be right out of the Yogacara school, because they also said that the clear light of awareness is the ground from which all things arise. So he says the deathless is the ground, the deathless is their destination, and the deathless is their final goal. Wow. Vastness is nothing other than what the Buddha called deathless. Often in the suttas, deathless is preceded by the word the, which actually is incorrect. There is no entity called the deathless, just like there is no entity called emptiness. It's a nature. It's the essence. It's the essence of the way things are. Deathless, empty, empty of inherent existence, empty of inherent separateness, empty of inherent solidity. Therefore, ultimately, they are not of the nature to die. Now, this is very important. I don't remember, it might have been Ajahn Sumedho. He used the word deathless a lot. He was really into the deathless. I remember someone asking him what he meant by deathless. And he said, dying is suffering. When experience is devoid of suffering, it is deathless. This makes a lot of sense, actually, because when you deconstruct the 5 aggregates, and you're not hoodwinked by them, you're not lost in clinging to some idea about yourself or the world or experience, you don't suffer. Therefore, there is no death from the experience. So in one way, when the Buddha talked about deathless, I think he was talking about awakening, a state in which there is no mental suffering. On the other hand, the Buddha often talked about merging with the deathless. Now that sounds like a thing, doesn't it? Sounds like there's something to merge into. I'd like you to consider that another quality of no death is timelessness. Death is about time. It's about entropy. So timelessness is another way to think of vastness, emptiness, and deathless. And Buddhist scholar Stephen Collins describes timelessness and deathlessness this way. It's an essential timelessness, both preceding and in some way underlying the ordered human world of time. Time basically is how we order everything. And he continues and says, this is the immobile hub of the moving wheel of time, the still point beyond the ceaseless movement of samsara. And you know, Buddhism, the wheel, the turning of the wheel, right? And then there's the hub in the center, and the center is the still point, where there is no movement, but there is movement. It's moving, but there is no movement in the center, yeah? That is a wonderful metaphor for not suffering. Not suffering doesn't mean you leave the world and you don't have the experience. It means in the midst of the turmoil that we call our world, there is a way in which one finds themselves still. Which, by the way, is another cause for deathless. If we go along this path of timelessness and stillness and movement, we might consider that deathless can be delineated when one is having some quality of stillness. I always wonder whether or not the stillness is merely an epiphenomena or it's the result of the quality of mind one must cultivate in order to know that which is something other than ordinary knowing. And remember what the Buddha said, develop and cultivate. And then one experiences the ground of whatever is arising. That deathlessness is the ground. And you know, many, many suttas feature the Buddha instructing the monks in concentration meditation, just like I instructed my patient in concentration meditation so he could anchor his mind, corral it in a little bit, and have a bit more capacity to be able to put his mind where he wanted it rather than be a slave to this going down the garden path, as he called it. So the lots of suttas have the Buddha instructing the monks in concentration meditation to achieve a clear, tranquil, one-pointed mind, capable of perceiving the subtle relative construction of the nature of reality and the underlying essence nature of reality, or the ground. You know, samadhi was of such primary importance to the Buddha and his instructions for awakening that many Buddhist schools insist that one-pointedness of mind is a necessary condition for access to insight. Without that, insight into reality is impossible for an untrained and unpliable mind. I have to say I tend to agree. I think there's levels of insight, there's levels of recognition. I'm not sure true insight into the nature of reality can be gained by a mind that is untrained and lost, that has no capacity for stillness. And maybe some of you have studied with teachers who've insisted on samadhi prior to insight. There are certainly schools of Theravāda teachings where they use insight as a way to achieve concentration. That absolutely exists. In fact, I know there are teachers that teach the Vipassana jhanas. So they don't use concentration to get to collected states of mind. They actually use insight to get there. But it is not what the Buddha taught primarily in the suttas. And it's not what is primarily taught in most of the Buddhist schools, which doesn't mean the other way doesn't work. So the outcome of concentration practice is described by the Buddha in this beautiful passage from the Itivuttaka, number 51. Itivuttaka is a collection called the Sayings of the Buddha. And he says, having touched with his own person the deathless realm that can't be owned, all grasping relinquished, the taints all gone, the awakened one displays the sorrowless state that's free from stain. Sorrowless, no suffering. So this is a description where merging into the deathless in that passage is a sorrowless state free from stain. It's not some unbounded, transcendent, all-knowing something. It's just a sorrowless state of mind, free from stain. And of course, that's really different from the Vedic notion of an Atman or a self merging with or becoming one with Brahma, the Godhead or the great oneness that is always taught in the Vedic teachings in Advaita Vedanta. And you know, the Buddha spent much of his teaching time sparring with Brahmin priests over what he viewed as their eternalist notions about enlightenment. I found two passages, once from the Majjhima Nikaya, and the Buddha describes their view in the following way. He said, they perceive, and this is a capital A. Every time you hear the word all, it's a capital A, representing Atman, the eternal self. They perceive all in all. Having perceived all as all, they conceive themselves as all. They conceive themselves in all. They conceive themselves apart or coming from all. They conceive all to be theirs. They delight in all. Why is that? Because they have not fully understood it, I say. So this is the Buddha basically arguing and saying, not only are you imagining that there is thingness to reality in its ultimate nature, but you're also saying you are that. You're actually taking it on. You're doing me and mine with the ultimate nature of reality. And this is why the Buddha was so insistent on emptiness, empty nature. Even the ground is empty of any inherent existence, separate or apart from anything else. This is, I'm sure you've all heard the Heart Sutra. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. This is what the Heart Sutra is saying. So the Buddha points to the deathless as awakening out of the dream of selfing and landing firmly in the thingless nature of all internal and external phenomena. A realization which quiets the underlying existential anxiety the mind is so often unconsciously driven by. And that underlying anxiety is a direct outcome of innate reification of self and world, as we discussed last week. One is inside, the other's outside. Both are apparently independent and self-existent, but in reality, they're not that at all. There is no inside, there is no outside. It just appears that way. That's the heaps hoodwinking you, thinking there's an inside and an outside. You're this little homunculus inside, everything else is outside, never the twain shall meet. All phenomena arise simultaneously in your perception, and there is no separateness, period. So now we're going to return to Nagarjuna, who we talked about last week, right? because he's the bridge between the Theravāda and the Mahāyāna teachings. And everything we've talked about so far tonight are mainstays in all the schools of Buddhism. The Theravāda, the Mahāyāna, and the Vajrayana. So Nagarjuna says, ultimate reality is contained within the limit of the non-inherent existence of a thing. You probably remember this from my talk last week. The deathless is ultimate reality. It's thingless, but it is ultimate reality. It's the ultimate nature. It's the essence of the way things are. And that which becomes apparent through wise recognition or right view. So the deathless is what one recognizes when one has right view of the empty nature of all phenomena. It's just as simple as that. There is no big thing called the deathless. It's just right view. So what happened to the deathless as Buddhism evolved? In the second and third turnings of the wheel of the Dharma, the Mahāyāna and Vajrayana. So Tathagata is a word that the Buddha used to describe himself in the Pali Sutta. Tathagata means thus gone. The Buddha came to beings with the teaching of deathlessness, to which he had gone through with his own practice. And with this term, the Buddha identified himself as the deathless, gone beyond self, beyond name and form. Now the Mahāyānist Tathāgatagarbha Sutra emerged in the 3rd century and preached a very specific doctrine. It said all beings, though they suffer with greed, hatred, and delusion, possess an innate, pristine, undefiled Buddha nature. And although the Tathāgatagarbha teachings were not directly associated with the Madhyamaka or with Yogacara, the term was mentioned in the Lagavacchara Sutta in conjunction with Alaya Vijnana. So the Tathāgatagarbha teachings are fully integrated into Tibetan Buddhism, where Buddha nature is considered the true nature of things and the true nature of all beings. So the deathless evolved into what was called buddhanature. You are already a Buddha, according to these teachings. You've never been anything other than a Buddha. The lens is obscured, so you don't recognize your Buddha nature. But you are already a Buddha. And the fruition of this vision is beautifully expressed in the Ocean of Definitive Meaning, which is one of 3 pivotal Mahamudra texts written in the mid-1600s by the 9th Gyalwang Karmapa. His name was Wanchap Dorje, and this was in Tibet. So he wrote this. The skandhas, so the 5 aggregates, are still happening for Tibetan Buddhism. The skandhas are primordially awakened. To assert that there is a superior Buddhahood to be attained that is other than mind, or to consider it impossible for completely pure Buddhahood to exist within the mind streams of impure sentient beings. All that is incorrect, because they are a perversion of the meaning of the abiding nature of mind. This can be illustrated by the examples of a poor person who has a treasure in her house, or the wrestler who has a jewel on his person. Not knowing this, both search elsewhere for their wealth. What he's saying here is, we seek something we already have intrinsically. There has never been a moment when the mind, in its clear light nature, has been anything other than awakened. It's how we perceive that clouds the perception of the awakened nature. But I assure you, it is there every single moment. And the Gyalwang Karmapa continues. He says the definitive secret is that all the excellent qualities of the Buddha are spontaneously present within your own body and mind. Therefore, do not search for Buddhahood other than within the mind. As it is said, nowhere in the world can a Buddha be found somewhere else. The mind is already the perfect Buddha. That is the true vastness. And I think the 9th Karmapa further clarifies a very basic misunderstanding many practitioners have about the deathless or the pure essence of mind. In this system, since the root of all phenomena is mind, it is not to be cast away. It is incorrect to assert that wisdom exists anywhere other than within the mind. Your own mind spontaneously exists from the beginning as wisdom, as the original mind. So this is where the deathless evolved to. I can end by bringing this full circle back to Ajahn Chah. One of the most beautiful quotes from Ajahn Chah integrates the deathless and buddhanature all in one. He says, about this mind, in truth, there is nothing really wrong with it. Within itself, it's already peaceful. Our practice is simply to see the original mind. Just this is the aim of all this difficult practice we put ourselves through. So when you seek deathlessness, seek wisdom, know things as they are, that is where there is no suffering. Rest in the ultimate nature of the way things arise, exist, and pass away. Just as my patient did with his wonderful news, and it's just another occurrence that comes and goes. And that is the liberation. That is a way of living without anxiety, without agitation, free from the entropy that is inherent in a mind that suffers.
Thanks for listening to today's show. To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.